What if I told you there's a machine so terrifying that enemy fighters would rather flee into the open desert than face it? A six-wheeled monster that climbs mountains no vehicle should ever conquer, carries enough firepower to obliterate an entire compound in 90 seconds, and moves through the darkness like a mechanical demon hunting its prey? The Taliban called it black magic. Local mullahs declared it proof of Western sorcery. Hardened insurgents who had fought the Soviets, who had battled American Marines, who feared nothing on this earth, would abandon their positions at the mere sound of its engine echoing through the valleys. This isn't some Hollywood fantasy. This is the Supacat HMT Extenda, the SASR's ultimate weapon, a rolling fortress that redefined modern warfare and turned the mountains of Afghanistan into a nightmare for anyone who heard its approach. Why don't you know about it? Because for nearly 2 decades, the full story remained locked behind layers of military classification, the missions too sensitive, the capabilities too advanced, the body count too staggering to publicly acknowledge. But today, that silence ends. I'm going to show you exactly what happened when Australian Special Forces unleashed this beast on unsuspecting enemy forces. How a single patrol of 3 vehicles could control territory the size of a small country. Why Taliban commanders issued orders forbidding their fighters from engaging these machines. And the classified operations that proved this wasn't just a vehicle, it was a psychological weapon that broke the enemy's will to fight. You think you know what modern military technology can do. You haven't seen anything yet. Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to reveal will change everything you thought you knew about special operations warfare. The dust clouds are rising on the horizon, the engine roar is getting closer, and there's nowhere left to hide. This is the story they didn't want told, the horror of the Supercat. The dust cloud appeared on the horizon like a sandstorm from hell itself. Taliban spotters in the Uruzgan mountains squinted through their binoculars, trying to make sense of what was coming. At first, they thought it was a convoy of American Humvees. Then the sound reached them, a deep, guttural roar that didn't belong to any ordinary vehicle. The growl of a Cummins diesel engine pushed to its limits, mixed with the high-pitched whine of a turbocharger sucking air through the thin mountain atmosphere. By the time they realized what was bearing down on them, it was already too late. 3 Supacat HMT Extenda vehicles crested the ridge at nearly 100 kilometers per hour. 6 massive wheels on each machine clawed at the rocky terrain with supernatural grip. Mounted atop each one sat an M2 Browning 50 caliber machine gun, its barrel already glowing from previous engagements. The Taliban fighters scattered like insects, but there was nowhere to run. The SASR patrol had planned this intercept for 72 hours, studying satellite imagery and drone footage until they knew every rock, every cave, every possible escape route. But this was merely the opening salvo. The lead gunner pressed his thumbs down on the butterfly trigger. The 50 cal erupted with a sound like the earth splitting open. Each round was as long as a man's hand and weighed nearly 200 grams of pure copper-jacketed devastation. The weapon cycled at 550 rounds per minute, though at this range it felt like a continuous stream of destruction. Rocks exploded into shrapnel. Mud walls disintegrated. Human bodies simply ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds, yet the compound that had stood for generations was reduced to rubble and dust. The Supercat wasn't just a gun platform, it was a rolling fortress that redefined what special operations forces could achieve in hostile territory, while American and British units relied on heavily armored vehicles that traded speed for protection. The SASR had chosen a different path. The HMT Extenda represented a philosophy born from decades of long-range reconnaissance patrol experience in some of the world's harshest environments. From the jungles of Vietnam to the deserts of Iraq, Australian Special Forces had learned one crucial lesson: mobility equals survival. Yet nobody understood just how far that philosophy would be pushed. The vehicle's designation told only part of the story. High Mobility Transporter. 3 simple words that concealed a machine of terrifying complexity. In Australia, the acquisition program was known as JP 2097, a bureaucratic label that gave no hint of the revolutionary capability it would deliver. The project began in the early 2000s when SASR planners realized their existing fleet of Land Rover Special Operations vehicles had reached the end of their operational life. Afghanistan demanded something entirely new, something that could survive where others failed. The British company Supacat had built a reputation for producing specialized military vehicles that pushed the boundaries of what was possible. Their engineers understood that special forces operators needed machines that could go anywhere, carry everything, and fight like nothing else on the battlefield. The result was a vehicle that looked like it had been designed by someone who had actually spent time being shot at in remote mountain valleys. 6 wheels instead of 4. That single design choice transformed everything. The 6x6 configuration provided redundancy that saved lives. Lose one wheel to a mine or enemy fire, and the vehicle kept moving. The suspension system was even more remarkable. Pneumatic rams at each wheel allowed the driver to adjust ride height on the move. Approaching a steep slope, raise the chassis to increase ground clearance, need to load the vehicle into a CH-47 Chinook helicopter, lower the entire platform until it fit through the cargo ramp. This wasn't just engineering cleverness. It was the difference between extraction and abandonment in hostile territory. What came next would shock even the engineers who built it. The real genius lay in the modular design philosophy. The Supercat could be reconfigured from a 4-wheel platform to a 6-wheel monster in less than 2 hours using basic hand tools. Need more cargo capacity for a 14-day patrol deep into enemy territory? Bolt on the extension kit, conducting a lightning raid where speed mattered more than payload? Strip it down to the lighter configuration, and this flexibility meant that SASR patrols could adapt their vehicles to specific mission requirements rather than adapting their missions to vehicle limitations. The transformation happened in dusty workshops at Campbell Barracks in Perth, where SASR troopers worked alongside civilian mechanics to prepare vehicles for deployment. These weren't showroom machines with factory warranties. Every Supercat that rolled out to Afghanistan had been modified, tested, broken, fixed, and modified again until it perfectly matched the unit's operational requirements. Extra fuel tanks bolted to the chassis, custom mounts for additional weapons, reinforced suspension components to handle loads that would have crushed civilian vehicles. The firepower mounted on these machines turned conventional military thinking inside out. A standard infantry platoon of 30 soldiers typically deployed with perhaps 2 medium machine guns and a handful of rifles. A 3-vehicle Supercat patrol carried more sustained firepower than an entire company. The primary weapon was the M2 Browning 50 caliber heavy machine gun, a design that dated back to 1919 but remained utterly devastating in the 21st century. But the Browning was only the beginning of the nightmare. The 50 caliber fired rounds capable of punching through concrete walls, disabling light armored vehicles, and engaging targets at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. In the hands of a trained SASR gunner, it became a precision instrument of controlled destruction. Many Supercats also mounted the Mark 19 automatic grenade launcher, a weapon that lobbed 40mm high-explosive rounds at a rate of 360 per minute. Each grenade had a casualty radius of 5 meters and could airburst over trenches or behind cover. Additional Mag 58 medium machine guns and 7.6 2mm were positioned at the front passenger station and rear cargo area. This meant that while the top gunner engaged with the 50 caliber, the vehicle commander could suppress flanking threats with the MAG, while the rear gunner covered withdrawal routes or engaged pursuit forces. The total ammunition load for a long-range patrol was staggering. Thousands of rounds of 50 caliber, boxes of Link 7.62, hundreds of 40mm grenades, plus personal weapons and ammunition for the 4-man crew. The weight of all this ordnance would have crushed lesser vehicles, but the Supercat's chassis was built like a bridge truss, distributing loads across the entire frame rather than concentrating stress at specific points. The 6-wheel configuration meant that weight was spread across more contact patches with the ground. The result was a vehicle that could carry over 2,000 kilograms of weapons, ammunition, fuel, water, and supplies, while still maintaining the agility to outrun pursuing forces. Then came the element that made Taliban commanders lose sleep. Armor was the one area where the Supercat made conscious sacrifices. Unlike heavily armored vehicles that could withstand direct hits from rocket-propelled grenades, the HMT relied on speed and firepower for protection. The floor pan incorporated blast-resistant materials designed to deflect the force of mines and improvised explosive devices away from the crew compartment. Tests showed that the vehicle could survive detonations equivalent to 10 kilograms of TNT directly beneath the chassis. Crew members would be severely shaken, possibly concussed, but they would survive, and the upper structure remained deliberately open. This contradicted every instinct of conventional military planners who wanted to wrap soldiers in as much steel as possible. But SASR operators understood that in long-range reconnaissance, the ability to see and shoot in all directions was more valuable than additional armor weight. 360 degrees of observation meant ambushes became far less effective. The crew could spot threats early and engage them at distance before they became critical. This design philosophy reflected decades of Australian Special Forces experience. In Vietnam, SASR patrols had survived through superior observation and movement rather than firepower. In the jungles, seeing the enemy first usually meant living through the contact. That same principle applied in Afghanistan, just with different terrain and much heavier weapons. The open turret configuration meant that gunners could traverse their weapons instantly in any direction. No hatches to open, no vision blocks to peer through, just immediate unrestricted fields of fire. What powered this beast made grown men weep with fear. The engine that drove the Supercat deserved its own place in the horror story. The Cummins diesel produced somewhere north of 300 horsepower, though exact specifications remained classified. What mattered was the performance envelope, 0 to 60 kilometers per hour in under 10 seconds despite weighing several tons, fully loaded. Top speed on flat ground exceeded 120 kilometers per hour, though sustaining that velocity on Afghan terrain was a good way to destroy suspension components and rattle internal organs into pudding. More impressive was the low-end torque. Diesel engines produced maximum pulling power at low RPM, which meant the Supercat could climb slopes that would defeat vehicles with twice the horsepower. SASR patrols exploited this capability ruthlessly. Taliban fighters positioned on mountain ridges assumed they were safe from vehicle-mounted weapons. Heavy trucks and armored personnel carriers couldn't reach them. And then the mountain itself seemed to come alive. A Supercat would appear, grinding up a 45-degree slope in low range, its 50 cal traversing to acquire targets that suddenly weren't so safe anymore. The sound of the engine became psychologically devastating to enemy forces. That particular combination of diesel clatter and turbocharger whine carried for kilometers in the thin mountain air. Taliban fighters learned to recognize it the way prey animals recognize the call of an apex predator. When you heard that sound, death was coming. You could run, you could hide, you could pray, but the machine would find you. Fuel consumption was catastrophic by civilian standards, but absolutely necessary for operational success. The Supercat could burn through 200 liters in a single day of hard driving. For a 14-day patrol operating hundreds of kilometers from any resupply point, that meant carrying nearly 3,000 liters of diesel. The vehicle's internal tanks held only a fraction of that. The rest traveled in jerry cans strapped to every available surface. The Supercat on long-range patrol looked less like a military vehicle and more like a mobile fuel depot that happened to bristle with machine guns. Water was equally critical. Humans in the Afghan summer heat could easily drink 6 liters per day just to stay functional. 4 crew members over 14 days needed 336 liters minimum plus extra for contingencies. Then add water for cooking, weapon cleaning, and emergency medical treatment. A realistic load approached 500 liters. All of this had to be carried on a vehicle that was simultaneously carrying enough ammunition to fight a small war. But the real test was still to come. The loading plan for a long-range patrol was a 3-dimensional puzzle that would have challenged professional movers. Heavy items like fuel and ammunition went low and centered to maintain stability. Water and rations distributed around the periphery. Spare parts, medical supplies, and communications equipment had to be accessible without unpacking everything else. Recovery gear, including winches, chains, and ground anchors, occupied dedicated mounting points. Every square centimeter of space was planned and utilized. The true genius of the Supercat system revealed itself when things went sideways. And in Afghanistan, things always went sideways. The patrol had been out for 9 days, operating in the greenbelt valleys of Uruzgan province where irrigation channels created bands of vegetation amid the desert wasteland. Intelligence indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was moving between villages, coordinating attacks on coalition supply routes. The SASR team had set up an observation post overlooking a likely crossing point, waiting for their target to appear. At 0300 hours, thermal imaging detected a convoy of vehicles approaching from the north. 6 Toyota Hilux pickups, the ubiquitous battle taxi of irregular forces worldwide. The lead vehicle carried what appeared to be a heavy machine gun mounted in the bed. Through night vision optics, the patrol leader could see at least 24 fighters, possibly more concealed in the truck beds. This was significantly more force than intelligence had predicted. What happened next would become legend. The decision matrix was simple and brutal. Allow the convoy to pass and maintain the observation post, hoping the high-value target would appear later, or engage now with overwhelming violence and risk blowing the entire mission. But there was a third option that only became available because of the Supercat's unique capabilities. Follow the convoy at distance, determine where it was going, and then make the decision based on better information. The 3 Supercats had been positioned in a wadi 300 meters from the observation post, camouflaged under netting and scattered vegetation. The crews had the vehicles started and ready to move in under 90 seconds. As the Taliban convoy passed, the SASR patrol fell in behind, maintaining a gap of 2 kilometers. At that distance, with headlights off, using only night vision and thermal imaging, they were effectively invisible. For the next hour, the pursuit continued across terrain that would have been impassable to conventional vehicles. The Toyota pickups bounced and skidded along goat tracks and dry stream beds. The Supercats followed effortlessly, their advanced suspension soaking up impacts that would have destroyed normal trucks. The 6-wheel configuration meant that even when one wheel dropped into a hole or climbed over a boulder, the other 5 maintained traction. It was like watching predators stalk prey, mechanical evolution in action. The convoy stopped at a compound in a narrow valley. Thermal imaging showed approximately 40 heat signatures inside the buildings. As the new arrivals dismounted, someone came out to greet them. Body language suggested this was a person of importance. The patrol leader made the call. This was the target, time to execute. The Supercats spread into assault formation, each vehicle taking a position that provided interlocking fields of fire while minimizing the risk of crossfire incidents. The compound had thick mud walls on 3 sides, but the 4th side faced the valley floor with only a low stone wall for protection. That's where the attack would come from. The patrol leader designated targets for each vehicle. Lead Supercat would engage the sentries and the technical truck with the mounted gun. Second vehicle would suppress the main building where the high-value target had entered. Third vehicle would cover the rear wall in case anyone tried to escape. The assault began with a single burst from a .50 caliber. The sentry never knew what hit him. His body simply disappeared in a spray of red mist and shredded clothing. The technical truck's gunner had perhaps 2 seconds to process what was happening before a stream of .50 caliber rounds walked up the hood, through the engine block, and into his position. The machine gun he'd been trying to traverse went silent as both gun and gunner ceased to exist as functional entities. Then all 3 Supercats opened fire simultaneously. The sound was indescribable. 350 cals firing in a coordinated pattern, supplemented by Mag 58s and the occasional grenade from an MK-19. The compound's mud walls might as well have been made of sand. 50 cal rounds punched straight through, continuing into the courtyard beyond. Anyone who had been standing in the open was simply erased. The volume of fire was so intense that the compound itself began to disintegrate, walls crumbling under the sustained hammering. The engagement lasted less than 90 seconds. By the time the SASR patrol leader called ceasefire, the compound resembled an archaeological ruin rather than a functioning structure. The thermal imaging showed no movement inside. A cautious approach confirmed what the optics suggested. The high-value target and his entire security element had been eliminated. The technical assessment was clinical. Overwhelming firepower applied with surgical precision had achieved total tactical success with 0 friendly casualties. But this engagement represented just one data point in the larger story. Between 2005 and 2013, these vehicles participated in hundreds of operations across the country. They escorted convoys through the most dangerous stretches of road. They provided mobile fire support for infantry units engaged in sustained firefights. They hunted high-value targets across terrain that defeated every other vehicle type in the coalition arsenal. The statistics told part of the story. SASR patrols using Supercats conducted reconnaissance missions averaging 12 days in duration, covering over 2,000 kilometers of hostile territory without resupply. They engaged enemy forces at ranges exceeding 1,500 meters, far beyond the effective range of the small arms and rocket-propelled grenades that Taliban fighters carried. The standoff distance meant that SASR patrols could destroy enemy positions while remaining effectively invulnerable to return fire. One particular mission profile became legendary within the regiment. Deep interdiction patrols would insert by helicopter into remote areas known to be Taliban strongholds. The Chinook would drop off the Supacats and crews, then disappear over the horizon. For 2 weeks, the patrol would move through the countryside like mechanical sharks. They appeared without warning to destroy weapons caches, ambush supply convoys, and eliminate leadership targets. The psychological impact on enemy forces was devastating. Nowhere was safe. Even in areas where coalition forces rarely operated, the Supercats could appear. The vehicle's ability to operate in extreme terrain became the stuff of legend. One patrol in Zabul province pursued a Taliban cell into a region of jagged mountain peaks that maps listed as impassable to vehicles. The enemy fighters scrambled up slopes approaching 60 degrees, certain they had escaped. They looked back to see 3 Supercats grinding up the mountainside, engines screaming in low range, all 6 wheels clawing for grip. At the summit, 1,500 meters above the valley floor, the 50 Cals opened fire. There were no survivors to spread the story, but coalition signals intelligence intercepted Taliban radio traffic describing armored vehicles that could climb like mountain goats. Maintenance became an ongoing challenge. The Supacat was designed for reliability, but the operating environment in Afghanistan was punishing beyond anything the engineers had anticipated. Dust infiltrated every seal and bearing. Temperature extremes ranged from -15°C in winter mountain operations to +50°C in summer desert patrols. The vehicles were driven hard, loaded beyond design specifications, and subjected to impacts and vibrations that would have destroyed civilian trucks. Yet the machines kept rolling. SASR vehicle mechanics developed a reputation for being able to repair anything anywhere. Broken suspension components were welded back together using portable generators and arc welding equipment. Failed electrical systems were bypassed with jury-rigged wiring harnesses. When replacement parts couldn't be sourced through official channels, mechanics fabricated them from raw materials or cannibalized damaged vehicles. The Supercat's modular design philosophy helped enormously. Components could be swapped between vehicles, allowing one damaged platform to be returned to service by harvesting parts from another. The crews developed an almost supernatural understanding of their machines. Drivers could diagnose engine problems by subtle changes in vibration or exhaust note. Gunners knew exactly how many rounds they could fire before the barrel overheated enough to affect accuracy. Vehicle commanders tracked fuel consumption down to the liter, calculating range and mission duration with the precision of accountants. This intimate knowledge meant that crews could push the vehicles to their absolute limits while still maintaining enough margin to get home. Getting home was never guaranteed. The distances involved in Afghan operations were staggering. A patrol inserting in Uruzgan province might need to move through Kandahar and Helmand to reach their target area, then return through Zabul and back to base. Total distance could exceed 1,000 kilometers, all through territory where any local farmer might be a Taliban spotter, any bridge might be mined, any tree line might conceal an ambush. The Supercat's speed and firepower provided options, but ultimately survival depended on crew skill and sometimes luck. One patrol experienced a catastrophic mechanical failure deep in hostile territory. The lead vehicle's engine threw a rod, punching a hole through the engine block and spraying oil and coolant across the desert floor. Normally, this would mean abandoning the vehicle and consolidating the crew into the remaining Supercats. But this particular vehicle was loaded with classified communications equipment that couldn't be left behind. The patrol leader made a decision that seemed insane. Under a camouflage net with sentries posted on surrounding high ground, the crew worked through the night to replace the damaged engine with a spare they had been carrying. The Supercat's modular design meant the engine could be removed and replaced using just the vehicle's own recovery equipment and basic tools. By dawn, the new engine was installed and running. The patrol continued its mission, completing the operation before returning to base 16 days after insertion. The damaged engine was later displayed at Campbell Barracks as a testament to crew ingenuity. The horror element of the Supacat story wasn't just about firepower and mechanical capability, it was about the psychological impact on enemy forces who found themselves facing a weapon system they had no effective counter for. Taliban tactics that worked against conventional forces failed completely against SASR patrols. Ambushes required getting close enough to engage with small arms and RPGs, but the Supercat's speed meant that patrols could often drive through kill zones before ambushes could be sprung, then turn around and destroy the ambush position from a distance. Roadside bombs were the Taliban's most effective weapon against coalition vehicles, but the Supercat's ground pressure distribution and blast-resistant floor meant that mines powerful enough to destroy heavy armored vehicles often only damaged a single wheel. The patrol would replace the wheel using spares carried on board and continue the mission. Even more frustrating for the Taliban, the Supacat's cross-country mobility meant that SASR patrols rarely used roads where mines could be easily implanted. The vehicles went straight across country, following routes that changed with every mission. Intercepted, Taliban communications revealed the psychological strain. Fighters described the vehicles as demons that appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. The sound of the engines was compared to dragons or evil spirits. Some local mullahs proclaimed that the machines were proof of Western black magic. Taliban leadership struggled to counter this claim. The superstition wasn't entirely irrational. From the perspective of fighters armed with Cold War-era weapons, the Supercat's capabilities did seem supernatural. The intelligence value of long-range patrols using Supercats extended far beyond direct action missions. The vehicles carried sophisticated signals intelligence equipment that could intercept and geolocate enemy radio and cell phone communications. By positioning themselves in remote areas and remaining silent for days, SASR patrols built detailed maps of Taliban command networks. This intelligence fed into broader coalition targeting efforts, enabling drone strikes and helicopter raids that dismantled enemy infrastructure. The visual signature of a Supercat patrol became iconic. 3 vehicles in loose formation spaced far enough apart that a single mine or RPG couldn't damage multiple platforms, close enough to provide mutual fire support, dust plumes trailing behind like the wake of speedboats. Crews scanning constantly with binoculars and optics, weapons traversing to track potential threats. The mechanical choreography of a well-trained patrol was beautiful in its deadly efficiency. At night, the transformation was complete. With headlights off and crews using night vision equipment, the Supercats moved through the darkness like ghosts. The engine noise remained, but without visual cues, enemy forces couldn't determine distance or direction. Taliban fighters manning checkpoints would hear the sound of diesel engines and know that somewhere in the darkness, the hunters were moving. Sometimes, the sound would fade as the patrol moved away. Sometimes, it would grow louder until the checkpoint erupted in flames as 50 Cal tracers found their mark. The thermal signature management was sophisticated for a vehicle of this type. The engine exhaust was routed to minimize the infrared bloom visible to thermal imaging systems. Special covers could be deployed over the engine compartment to reduce heat radiation. It wasn't true stealth, but it degraded enemy surveillance capabilities enough to matter. Combined with careful route selection and timing, SASR patrols could often achieve tactical surprise even in areas where the enemy had early warning systems. Photography of Supercats in action became tightly controlled. The vehicle's exact capabilities, weapon loadouts, and electronic systems remained classified. Official images showed the basic platform but carefully avoided revealing modifications and operational equipment. This information security was critical. If Taliban forces understood exactly what they were facing, they might develop effective countermeasures. Better to maintain the aura of invincibility, letting enemy fighters believe the vehicles were even more capable than reality. The training required to operate a Supercat in combat was extensive. Drivers spent weeks learning how to exploit the vehicle's capabilities across different terrain types. Gunners fired thousands of rounds, learning the nuances of each weapon system and how to coordinate fire with other vehicles in the patrol. Vehicle commanders studied tactics, learning how to position their vehicles for maximum advantage while minimizing exposure to enemy fire. The collective training culminated in multi-week exercises that replicated Afghan conditions as closely as possible, but no amount of training could fully prepare crews for the reality of sustained combat operations. The first time a crew took contact, when rounds started cracking overhead and impacts kicked up dust around the vehicle, training had to become instinct. The crews that succeeded were those who could maintain tactical discipline while processing the chaos of combat. The Supacat gave them the tools: superior firepower, superior mobility, superior observation. But using those tools effectively under fire required a particular type of calm that couldn't be taught. The casualty rates told the story. SASR patrols operating Supercats sustained remarkably few serious injuries despite conducting hundreds of missions in hostile territory. When casualties did occur, they typically resulted from mines or IEDs rather than direct fire engagements. The vehicle's protective systems and the crew's tactical skills meant that firefights almost invariably ended with enemy forces destroyed and the patrol intact. This wasn't invulnerability. It was the result of combining superior equipment with superior training and tactics. Individual acts of courage were common but rarely publicized. One vehicle commander held his position under sustained enemy fire for 40 minutes. He called in air support while his gunners systematically destroyed enemy fighting positions. The .50 caliber barrel glowed cherry red from the sustained firing. When ammunition began running low, the commander redistributed rounds from the other vehicles by driving between them while still under fire. The action resulted in 27 confirmed enemy eliminations and the safe extraction of a pinned-down infantry unit. Another crew executed a daring rescue when a coalition helicopter was shot down in Taliban-controlled territory. The Supercat patrol was 40 kilometers away when the call came in. They covered the distance in 23 minutes, driving at speeds that should have destroyed the suspension. The crash site was already surrounded by enemy fighters moving in for the harvest. The three Supercats created a defensive perimeter, their combined firepower holding off several hundred Taliban fighters for 2 hours until a quick reaction force arrived. All helicopter crew members survived. These missions accumulated into a combat record that redefined what light special operations forces could achieve. Historically, reconnaissance units avoided direct combat when possible, using stealth and evasion rather than firepower. The Supercat inverted that calculus. SASR patrols actively sought contact, knowing they possessed overwhelming advantages in firepower and mobility. The psychological impact was strategic. Taliban forces had to commit resources to defending areas they had previously considered safe, spreading their strength thinner across the country. The vehicle's service life in Afghanistan spanned the full evolution of the campaign. Early deployments in 2005 saw Supercats supporting conventional forces in relatively permissive environments. By 2008, as the Taliban insurgency intensified, the vehicles were conducting deep penetration raids into areas where coalition forces rarely operated. The final deployments in 2013 focused on training Afghan National Army Special Forces, passing on the tactics and techniques that had proven so effective. Post-Afghanistan, the Supercat platform continued evolving. Lessons learned from combat operations fed into design modifications for the next generation of vehicles. The fundamental concept remained sound: long-range mobility, heavy firepower, and minimal armor, but refinements improved reliability, increased payload capacity, and integrated new weapons and sensors. The vehicles that entered service in the 2020s bore visible heritage to the Afghan-era platforms, but represented significant technological advancement. The legacy extended beyond mere tactical victories. It proved that light special operations forces equipped with the right vehicles could achieve strategic effects in counterinsurgency operations. The combination of long-range mobility and overwhelming firepower allowed small teams to control vast areas of territory. This lesson influenced military procurement decisions in multiple countries. The era of lightly armed reconnaissance vehicles was over. The new generation would follow the Supercat model: fast, heavily armed, and absolutely lethal. The dust clouds on the horizon that signaled an approaching patrol became symbols of inevitable destruction. The sound of Cummins diesels howling through the mountains meant that death was coming, and there was nothing that could stop it. The sight of 6 massive wheels churning across terrain that should have been impassable meant that there was nowhere to hide, nowhere to run, nowhere to be safe. This was the true horror of the Supercat, not the physical destruction it could inflict, though that was terrible enough, but the knowledge that you were facing a machine purpose-built to hunt you down and eliminate you with mechanical efficiency. The crews who operated these machines understood this psychological dimension perfectly. They weren't just destroying enemy forces, they were breaking the will to fight. Every engagement, every successful patrol, every impossible feat of mobility or marksmanship fed into a narrative that the Taliban couldn't counter, the narrative that said Australian Special Forces were unstoppable, that their machines were invincible, that resistance was futile. It was psychological warfare conducted with diesel engines and 50 caliber machine guns, and it worked. Taliban fighters learned to avoid areas where SASR patrols operated. The mere rumor that the Supercats were in the region was enough to disrupt enemy operations. Intelligence intercepts showed fighters arguing about whether to proceed with planned attacks or withdraw to safer areas. The SASR patrols had achieved the ultimate goal of special operations forces. They had multiplied their effectiveness far beyond their actual numbers through superior tactics, training, and equipment. The horror story of the Supercat ultimately wasn't about a vehicle. It was about what happens when you give highly trained special operations forces exactly the tool they need to prosecute their mission. The Taliban fighters who encountered SASR patrols faced an enemy that could see farther, move faster, shoot harder, and survive longer than anything they had ever confronted. The psychological impact was cumulative and devastating. Areas of the country that should have been Taliban strongholds became hunting grounds where predators roamed freely. The legacy written in the mountains and deserts of Afghanistan would echo through military history for generations. Not as a tale of technological superiority alone, but as a demonstration of what happens when innovation meets determination on the battlefield. The Supercat wasn't just a vehicle, it was a statement, a declaration that nowhere was safe, that no terrain was impassable, that no enemy was beyond reach. The 6 wheels kept turning long after the last patrol returned home.